إذا نبث بصورة حية على صفحة المجلس في فيسبوك. طبعا مساءكم مجددا. أنا الياس قطار، مسؤول النشر والتحرير في المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية. أهلا بكم في حلقة النقاش الثانية من ضمن حلقتي نقاش ينظمهما المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية بالتعاون مع منظمة اليونسكو حول العلوم الإنسانية النقدية في المنطقة العربية، أجندات وممارسات. تتناول هذه الحلقة المنصات النسوية وتبث على صفحة المجلس في فيسبوك بصورة حية. نذكركم بأن الترجمة الفورية إلى العربية والإنجليزية متاحة للمشاركين والمشاركات عبر منصة زوم. كما نشجعكم على طرح أسئلتكم في خانة سؤال وجواب Q&A على زوم، وفي خانة تعليق كومنت للمتابعين والمتابعات عبر فيسبوك. من دون أي تأخير، الآن كلمة تمهيدية للحلقة الثانية وتقديم المتحدثات مع المديرة العامة للمجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية الدكتورة ستاني شامي. تفضلي دكتورة ستاني.
شكرا الياس، وأهلا بكم مجددا في حلقة النقاش الثانية حول العلوم الإنسانية النقدية في المنطقة العربية. كما ذكر زميل الياس، هذه الحلقة ضمن نشاطات وتعاون بين المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية ومنظمة اليونسكو. عندنا تعاون جيد ومثمر مع اليونسكو، سواء من خلال المكتب الرئيسي في باريس أو مكتب بيروت أو مكتب القاهرة. هذه الجلسة تم إعدادها بالتعاون مع مكتب اليونسكو في القاهرة، ونأمل أن تشجع هذه الحلقات على تبادل الأفكار والنقاش حول السياقات الصعبة في المنطقة العربية اليوم، من حيث تأثيرها على إنتاج المعرفة وعلى الممارسات التي تجمع بين البحث والنشاطية وتبشر بالتغيير. الحلقة الأولى سلطت الضوء على تعقيدات ممارسة الإنسانيات وممارسة البحوث، خاصة البحوث الميدانية، في ظل ما يمكن وصفه بأزمنة غير إنسانية، فالإنسانيات في أزمنة غير إنسانية. فالمنطقة العربية ومجتمعاتها وشعوبها تهزها الصراعات والتمزقات والصدامات مادياً ومعنوياً. في هذه الحلقة الثانية نعاين المواقع المتعددة لإنتاج المعرفة النسوية، بما في ذلك الجامعات ومعاهد البحوث والأرشيفات ومنصات الوسائط البديلة Alternative Social Media. فلما التركيز على المنصات النسوية؟ الحركات النسوية والبحوث حول الجندر دائما كانت تحولية في المنطقة، من حيث الممارسات والمؤسسات السياسية والاقتصادية والفكرية والثقافية، وكان الفكر النسوي دائما في صدارة الابتكارات في هذا المجال. لهذا السبب ارتأينا أن نركز على المنصات النسوية، وخاصة المنصات الجديدة أو من النوع الجديد، أو التي تستخدم الآليات والأدوات الجديدة المتاحة في المجال الافتراضي. يعني المداخلات التي سنسمعها ستتناول عدة جوانب من هذا الموضوع، بما في ذلك مؤسسة الأبحاث النسوية، برامج الدراسات الجندرية في جامعة المنطقة، التقاطع المهم بين الجامعات والمنظمات غير الحكومية في إنتاج المعرفة، وأيضاً في العمل، ليس فقط في المعرفة وإنما أيضاً في العمل. وأهمية كل هذا في إنتاج معرفة مستقلة وذات تأثير وتداول عام. وتقدم العروض والمداخلات منظوراً جندرياً حول أدوار النساء، الأدوار المتعددة للنساء وفي المنطقة العربية، من خلال تفكيك الوسائل التي يشغلنا بها الفضاء العام والخطاب العام. المتحدثات في هذه الحلقة الثانية هن هدى الصدى من جامعة القاهرة، ديما قائد بي من ورشة المعارف، ولينا أبو حبيب من معهد الأصفري الجامعة الأمريكية في بيروت. المداخلة ستكون بالإنجليزية، فالترجمة متاحة موجودة، والنقاش ممكن تكون بالعربية وبالإنجليزية حسب اللغة التي تطرح فيها الأسئلة. فأحول الكلمة مباشرة إلى الزميلة الدكتورة هدى الصدى. تفضل.
شكرا ستني، وشكرا للمجلس على يعني تنظيم هذه الندوة أو الويبينار. أنا موضوعي هيكون لحظة، موضوعي عن بدايات برامج Women and Gender Studies في العالم العربي، وأنا يعني ورقتي باللغة الإنجليزية فاسمحوا لي أن أتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية. we're talking about the emergence of women and gender studies programs in the Arab world. And if we start with a global perspective, we see that the introduction of women and gender studies programs in universities and their institutionalization as academic disciplines, they started in the 1970s in the US, in Australia and New Zealand, and expanded and spread in the 80s and 90s across the globe. These programs responded to the demands of women's movements in these countries for the production of feminist knowledges, to counter hegemonic masculinist histories and epistemologies, and empower women's rights movements. Now, the institutionalization of these programs and research followed very diverse academic and political trajectories. Each country has its own story. Now, to move to the Arab world, the beginnings of the production of knowledge in the field of women and gender studies in the Arab world began in the 1980s and into the 1990s, not as programs and institutes in universities, but in independent research organizations that emerged and spread in the context of a relative political liberalization in many Arab countries. The noted exception was the Women's Studies Institute, established in 1973 at the Lebanese American University in Beirut, formerly a women's college. The trajectory of women and gender studies in the Arab world is a direct consequence of political constraints in undemocratic post-colonial Arab states, as well as the status and histories of national higher education institutions. So in my presentation, I argue that women and gender studies in the Arab world is actually an NGO phenomenon. It developed and was nurtured by feminist activists in the Arab world who founded independent women's organizations in the 80s and the 90s, and who seized the opportunities that were made available by the political transformations in Arab regimes, the internationalization of women's rights issues on a global scale, and the history of activism and struggle for rights in the context of authoritarian post-colonial states. So I'll look at three things. I'll shed light on the contexts and histories that were conducive to the emergence and development of programs in civil society institutions, that is in NGOs, prior to their institutionalization in universities. I will look at the political, conceptual, and social challenges that constrain the development of the field, and then I will try to chart some key trends and trajectories in the production of knowledge on women and gender studies in the Arab world. So if we look at the very beginnings, women's movements in the Arab world, similar to women's movements across the globe, constitute the spark and force behind the growth of research in the field of women and gender studies. I mean, this is global. So from the end of the 19th century, beginnings of the 20th, we witnessed the beginnings of feminist consciousness and women's activism expressed in the emerging media and the publication of treaties and articles by women. And then fast forward to the 50s and 60s, we see a relative decline in independent women's movements and the rise of state feminisms as post-colonial states, these new modern post-colonial states, restricted the ability of civil society organizations to act and organize independent of state control. Now, two important developments took place at the end of the 70s and the 80s that resulted in loosening the grip of states on independent women's movements, groups, and allowed for the emergence of a new generation of women's NGOs in the 80s and the 90s. The first, and very briefly, is the economic liberalization policies adopted by some Arab states, which went parallel to political liberalization and the establishment of multi-party systems in many Arab countries. The second important development is the internationalization of women's rights. What does that mean? So in the Second World Conference on Women held in Nairobi in 1985, it was described by many as the birth of global feminism, as it situated women's rights agendas at the center of world politics. The Beijing Platform for Action in 1995 declared women's rights as human rights and committed states to specific actions to guarantee their compliance with the agreed resolutions. It also committed governments to create national machineries for the monitoring and advancement of women at the highest level of government. So it was within the framework of these global directives, for example, that national councils for women or other forms of national machineries were established in Arab countries. So it was a global movement. So a second generation of Arab women's movements appeared in the 80s and the 90s in many Arab countries. Several of the founders of the first women's rights NGOs were women who had a history in political activism or were members of political parties. These NGOs in the Arab world created opportunities for research and training for researchers and academics who either established or joined NGOs as a way of circumventing the many restrictions and limitations imposed in academic institutions. Restrictions varied in magnitude and specific context, but just to name some: absence of safeguards for academic freedom, lack of autonomy of many Arab universities, political intervention and manipulation, the ever-decreasing resources for national universities as governments in the region move towards an educational module of privatization. Now, however, we need to remember that NGOs were not necessarily safe havens for research and activism, as they had to contend with many political, cultural, and financial challenges and constraints. Their legal status was precarious, and their ability to function was contingent on political considerations that were beyond their control. So, to cut it short, these NGOs walked a tight line on the margins of power. And so lots of challenges, minimal grassroots bases, most of them dependent on international funding for their existence. And this rendered them easy targets for politically motivated smear campaigns. And of course, in addition, their dependency on international funding trapped them in a system where sustainability was an upward struggle. So if we look at a general survey of the trends and themes that were tackled by these women's NGOs reveals a very varied scene. It's a developmental focus on social and economic challenges to women and the impact of inequality on their lives and families, a cultural focus on identity issues, debates on the role of religions and the challenges of interpretation from a gender lens, feminist post-colonial critiques of representations of Arab women and Muslim women in Western discourses and media, critiques of modernist discourses on the woman question in the Arab world, revisiting Arab histories from a gender lens, and so on. Now, the opening of political and cultural spaces also enabled the publication of specialized journals, magazines, and the founding of publishing houses. There's no time to go into, giving examples, but I'm happy to answer questions. So if we go to the new generation of women and gender studies programs in Arab universities, we find that they emerged in response to the focus of international organizations on promoting gender education as a means of gender empowerment. And this began in the 1990s. It was emphasized in 2000 as one of the key UN Millennium Development Goals. As these programs found their way into universities, many of the programs were conceptually structured within a framework of neoliberal policies in higher education institutions and entrenched in market logic and neoliberal language. So if we look, many institutes were established inside universities at the end of the 90s and into the 2000s. The stories behind the institutionalization of these programs feature the efforts of determined and strong activists who had strong ties with women's movements and have succeeded in establishing gender programs, often against the desire of university leadership. So Marie Stadros looked at the three key orientations of the women and gender studies programs in Arab universities, and we find that they're very similar to the trends in the NGOs. So feminist literary and post-colonialist studies, which focus on theorization and problematization of representations of women in the Middle East, in particular in Western discourse and paradigms, a gender and development orientation, a family Muslim orientation with a focus on identity issues. So we can see that the above survey of trends and directions very much developed within NGOs, and these were the main orientations that were actually that they were built on, and they complemented the accumulation of knowledge produced by women's NGOs. Now, it's worth noting that the mandates of women and gender studies in Arab universities mirror those of NGOs. So, I mean, actually, and if you look at some of the websites, it's like a website of an NGO. They talk about capacity building, empowerment, training programs, advocacy, producing policy briefs. Women and gender studies university programs are also supported by grants from international donors who have funded and continue to fund women's NGOs established in the 80s and the 90s. So again, very much like NGOs, they rely on foreign funding. Their situation at university are actually, again, precarious. And finally, we find that despite, I mean, we think of academic institutions as safe havens for research, but this is not necessarily the case. So, and if we have, for example, several examples in 2016, after a controversy over a debate with a professor in the Sharia College on the subject of women and Islam, Hatoun al-Fasi, a Saudi academic at Qatar University, was accused of criticizing the Quran, was put under surveillance, and then banned from teaching her course. And there are many examples of women academics inside universities who had to face similar challenges. Right, so I'm trying to, so let me come to a couple of concluding points. So women and gender studies between NGOs and universities in the 20th and 21st century, what do we do? Two questions arise. The first, to what extent will the institutionalization of women and gender studies programs in Arab universities succeed in producing new knowledges that can potentially lead to a more just and equitable world? Second question, will the neoliberalization and privatization, of course, of universities in the Arab world, in addition to the compromised track record of Arab universities due to political interventions, continue to push cutting-edge and critical research in the humanities and the social sciences outside university walls to independent research organizations? That's the second question. Now, the answer to the second question, I will say, remains to be seen. I won't speculate. But I'd like to conclude with reflections on the first question, as it touches upon the issue of the coloniality of knowledge production and the coloniality of power, which is an established regime of truth in global higher education, in which the North dominates the production and circulation of knowledge, and the overriding assumption is that the South produces raw data, not theory, in which knowledge production from the peripheries is not quoted, and scholars from the South must publish in international journals in English to be recognized. And we've already started the discussion about writing and publishing and supporting researchers in the Arab world and publishing in Arabic in the previous session. So perhaps we can continue this conversation. Now, this state of affairs has resulted in a universalistic understanding of gender and a universalistic approach to gender studies in universities, which is a challenge. Now, this binary between the universes versus culturally specific epistemologies is, of course, a persistent challenge to women and gender studies globally. We don't want to go into binary thinking, but at the same time, there is an issue of coloniality of knowledge production. Now, to pin this down to the status of knowledge produced by NGOs in the Arab world and the possibilities for its integration in course curricula, in programs inside universities, again, many other issues arise. From a practical point of view, NGO publications qualify as gray literature, meaning publications with limited circulation and access. Very difficult to find them. Again, in the previous session, we talked about the need for a database where we can all access knowledge produced in Arabic. There is no Arab database or library where a researcher can access all NGO gray literature, even books published by publishing houses very often can qualify as gray literature, actually. The challenge in integrating gray literature in universities is not limited to the difficulties in access and circulation. It's also an issue of what counts as credible knowledge, i.e. knowledge that has gone through the global process of legitimation, peer reviewing, publishing in international accredited journals, and so on. In addition, most of this knowledge is written and published in Arabic, which in the context of unequal power relations in the circulation of knowledge production, the Arab world resides on the peripheries of power centers. Research published in Arabic is rarely quoted in international publications on the Arab world, even if the topic is very much about the Arab world. Even Arabic literature very often. Now, notwithstanding all of the above challenges, I still think that women and gender studies in the Arab world promises to be a vibrant field of knowledge production. Political and social constraints may have the short-term effect of limiting research, undermining researchers in the field, but in the long term can potentially be a force that energizes creativity and contestation of the status quo. And we've seen this in the last 10 years after the Arab revolutions. So there's contestation of status quo, and by extension, a contestation and rethinking of epistemological assumptions, which are crucial factors for the growth and strength of fields of knowledge. So right now, and what we see happening right now actually is that more and more feminist scholars across the globe are joining efforts to undercut the unequal power dynamics in the production and circulation of knowledge by publishing their work, for example, in open source venues, allocating more funds to translation and publishing in multiple languages, exploring diverse epistemologies. So these are all very active acts addressing the coloniality of power in knowledge production. I stop here.
Thank you so much هدى. شكرا هدى. ننتقل مباشرة للمداخلة الثانية زميلتنا ديما قائد بيت. تفضلي ديما.
Thank you, Satani. مرحبا جميعا. It's good to be here, and I'm short on time, so I'll try to be as concise as possible in presenting the paper that I wrote for World Humanities report, which was on feminist platforms, so sort of the spaces of knowledge production outside of university. And I called it On Feminist Platforms in the MENA, Experiments with New Terms and New Terms of Engagement. And in it, I look at feminist and queer feminist platforms that are reflecting really significant changes in feminist language and in frameworks and in ways of operating. These sort of shifts in discourse have been happening really since the early 2000s, but they're becoming more noticed, or they've been gaining increasing attention since maybe the past decade, from academia, from media, often alternative media, and from more established feminist spaces or NGOs. So to give an example, in 2012, Zakiya Salimi noted that there is what she termed something worth documenting emerging in feminist spaces in Morocco after the 2011 protests, that there's a new feminism taking shape, often outside known feminist organizations. Similarly, Rita Stefan notes that after the 2005 Cedar Revolution, there's a new wave happening with queer women, for example. The traditionally ostracized groups such as queer women have become a center of its discourse. In Egypt, Hala Kamal notes how after 2011, there's a turn on looking at sexual violence and sexuality. In 2020, there was an article in Fanac online magazine saying, again, a new wave of feminism or a new face of feminism in Tunisia with a focus on LGBTQ issues. So we see there's more attention, more visibility after social changes, after protests and revolutions. But these platforms also, it's not just the attention, it's that they also gain some kind of momentum when there's changes, when there's protests. And in platforms, when I'm looking at platforms, I'm looking at spaces that develop, archive and or disseminate critical feminist content, irrespective of its structure and mode of organizing. So these platforms are using online activism, writing, performances, They can be doing participatory research, or they can be working on the ground in addition to being online. What I did in my essay was I sort of did an incomplete mapping of different feminist platforms, incomplete because they're so diverse in language, in the mediums they use, in their histories and what they talk about. But I focused on three main groups: from Egypt, Wikigender; from Western Sahara, Towards a Feminist Consciousness, or نحو وعي نسوي; and from Lebanon, the journal الكحل. And I argued that these sites are experiments in feminist analyses of issues, expanding what feminism in Arab majority countries means and looks like. And I was intentional in using the word experiments, an experimental approach, because it was a way to recognize that the process of introducing something new and figuring out these new topics or connections or ways of operating, and they don't have to be new topics, but new ways of looking at them. But they're also benefiting from old and renewed tools and skills and knowledges. So to experiment, of course, is not to take away from the expertise or experience or accumulated knowledge. Sometimes it's quite the opposite. But I also wanted to say and to see how these spaces are always recalibrating, transforming, maybe even playing. So for my research, I contacted members, usually founders, co-founders, affiliated with the platforms, and I asked them about how these platforms came to be and the impact they have had. And what emerged for me are three keywords that can describe the work that they're doing or the work that they want to do. The first keywords is intersectionality, and really next to it is transnationality. So intersectionality was a word that I heard in all the responses from every group that I contacted. This focus on intersectionality implies an attention to various intertwined systems at play. I saw the term also being used to denote a refusal to prioritize any issue over another or claim any hierarchy of issues. It has also come to indicate that a group pays attention to, in its language or in the way it organizes, the perspectives of historically marginalized communities within their context. And since these platforms have built a web of relations across borders, their communities are also transnational. So for me, and I think as I saw it, intersectionality and transnationality were very interlinked, sometimes because when they talked about intersectional politics, they wanted to be inclusive and were inclusive of refugees and migrants, and because they're thinking and connecting across communities, across borders, across different categories of religion, ethnicity, citizenship, gender identities, all these things together. So the first collective that I approached was Toward Feminist Consciousness, نحو وعي نسوي. And they told me that they started because they felt a strong urge to bring together and organize feminists from Western Sahara and to amplify their voices. They wanted to move away from like fragmented individual voices to one collective integrated front as a way to approach patriarchy and colonialism as intersecting oppressions. They told me that they first started creating a safe space. They reached out to a feminist in Mauritania. They first had a group on WhatsApp, and then in 2018, they emerged online with the blog نحو وعي نسوي. And like many groups, especially the newer groups, نحو وعي نسوي sort of was built on an infrastructure that is already there in terms of feminist movements in the MENA and platforms in the MENA, with the work, with the intention to archive the feminist movement around them. Similar, they told me it was similar to what many other platforms have been doing in the region. So they acknowledge and see and want to see this lineage. So they started with feminists in Western Sahara and Mauritania, but by the time I was doing my research, there were writers feminist writers from Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Palestine, and Sudan. And they're very particular in that their work is at the intersection of national liberation and feminism, but they have different topics that they're always addressing along the lines of women's bodies, pleasure, motherhood, surviving sexual violence. And they see all these as being interrelated. Another group that was formed in 2016 was Wikigender. So they first emerged in Cairo. I talked to its member, Aya, and she tells me how when they first emerged at the seed of the idea, they were very, they didn't want to be Cairo-based or just Egyptian-based. So they wanted to connect transnationally across the MENA region. They held a meeting in Beirut in 2017. And it included Palestinian, Syrian, Lebanese members. And of course, what's unique about Wikigender is its wiki structure. It's a participatory platform that theoretically permits anyone to edit and add to the site, and where knowledge is assembled, organized in a variety of different groups and sites and resources. And so part of where we see that experimenting happening here is that after a period of time, the Wikigender team decided that only team members can edit, but they're always playing around and experimenting with their editorial policies and practices. And Aya calls the work they do, quote, participatory space for expression and experimentation. In 2018, they had meetings in Beirut in Tunisia. In 2020, they held online trainings for feminists in Palestine and Western Sahara to bring feminists from two communities living under occupation. And this is where the connection's also happening with Nahwa Wa'i Niswi, because I'm pretty sure a big constituency of the feminists from Western Sahara were from Nahwa Wa'i Niswi. In addition to intersectionality and transnationality, the term queer was central for most of the platforms I looked at, whether or not they identified as queer or queer feminist space. Their work was inclusive of issues of non-normative sexualities and gender identities. And queer feminism can be seen to be experimental in and of itself, often by how much it can denote or the wide variety of definitions and frameworks it can hold. So queer feminism can be a signifier of groups who disrupt gender binaries. And I take here Wikigender as an example, with their playing around with Arabic language. So Arabic is very gendered. What Wikigender is playing around with, if we take, for example, the plural of researchers, bahithat in the feminine, bahithin in the masculine. Wikigender has created the "it" suffix, so bahithit, as a way to be gender neutral or gender inclusive, and to sort of break the gender binaries. So this is playing, whether or not I've seen some platforms and some individuals take on that play of words, but whether or not it becomes much more common, this use of "it" suffix instead of bahithat, the "at," or bahithin, the "in" at the end. It's very interesting to see it happening. And of course, queer feminism can also be about disrupting socially normative practices, structures, and attitudes, and about centering individuals and communities who have been marginalized due to these dominant practices and structures. Often about gender and sexuality, but not always exclusively about that. And this is something the journal, my third case study, journal Kahal does. Kahal, a journal for body and gender research, identifies as an intersectional and transnational queer feminist space. I talked to its founder, Wasaya, and she described the journal as being, quote, part of the lineage of archival queer and feminist work that preceded us in Beirut, end of quote. Saya also goes on to situate the journal transnationally. She says, quote, from a transnational perspective, our queer and intersectional politics are informed by Black feminist thought, queer resistance to occupation, sex radical movements, and global South leftist movements, end of quote. For Kahal, and so we see here the different influences that they're bringing about. And again, for Kahal, whether the topic is on reproductive justice, borders and migration, representation, the economy, revolutions, queer feminist knowledge production focuses on disrupting the normative discourse through investigating intersecting systems and oppression. And what I see a distinguishing feature of the journal is its focus on the queerness of the term queer, and here queerness would mean like the focus on sex and pleasure and disrupting both homonormative and heteronormative representations. In sort of to start to conclude, the platforms that my paper, when I was writing the paper, I wanted to engage with platforms that are producing critical knowledge outside academic institutions, spaces where new words are constantly being formed or reformed and language is being reshaped, and where frameworks are continually attempted to be expanded and pushed. And I don't want to create here any binary between academic and activist spaces. In many of the cases, many of members, founders, co-founders of these institutions or platforms may have some kind of academic background or affiliation, but also increasingly, we see how some of the content that these platforms are producing are finding their way to university classrooms, whether because the students are reading them, but a lot of the times because the teachers, the instructors are using this material, usually in maybe gender studies courses in the MENA and the global north. Now, this may be expected in the case of Kahal, which from the beginning understood itself and presented itself as producing work which bridges academia and activism. But for example, to look at the case of Wikigender, Aya from Wikigender expressed her surprise that academics are really referring to Wikigender because, as she said, usually academics do not legitimize a wiki site which permits anyone to edit and contribute. And so finally, to end, I see these platforms, and these platforms, I think not just me, but these platforms really have ushered in spaces and period of knowledge production and of learning that live inside and between both established older feminist and activist spaces and academic spaces, and that's being shaped and used by very varied communities, artists, scholars, activists, translators, journalists, different kinds of people and spaces. And I'm gonna end here. Thank you.
So much, Dima. We move to our speaker, Lina Abu Habib. تفضلي Lina.
Shukran, Satani. Very nice to be with you all the friends from ACSS who have a very, very special place in my heart. I'm incredibly happy to be with you, and also to be talking about this topic, which is kind of recent, and literally recent in terms of timeline, and I will explain a little bit. And the way I will go about it, I will be talking about a recent form of feminist activism, and what is it bringing with it in terms of what kind of knowledge production it's begging, what kind of new research questions it's bringing to the forefront. And as I said, what I'm talking about refers to Lebanon particularly, and refers to different forms of collective feminist mobilizations in the specific situation in Lebanon. So as you know, I'm not going to go through the drama of what has been happening the last 2-3 years, but my starting point is actually the August blast. Again, not going into the details of what it was and how horrible it was, we all know this. But right after the blast on August 4, of course, as expected, there was a flurry of intervention of international aids, and immediate reports were started to circulate. One of these famous reports by a really kind of a reference international organization simply said, and we didn't look at gender implications of the blast because it's too complicated. And it was that particular statement, shocking statement, I would say, in 2020, that many feminist organizations didn't accept this, didn't accept the fact that yet again, after such a major disaster, we think that gender is too complicated and probably everybody has been affected in the same way. This period, and it was like 6 months into the blast, saw the birth of something called the Lebanese Feminist Platform. This was not initially set up to be a knowledge production framework. It was set up to be to bringing together voices, feminist voices, to basically counter that argument, which is gender is too complicated to understand in a situation of major disaster. Having been, engaged in a number, and this is my own positionality as a feminist activist, but also as a feminist researcher, having been engaged, and also the question of age, having been there for a little bit more than 3 decades, actually, perhaps 4 decades, I have seen different women platforms of women rights organizations, networks, coordination bodies, etc., happening and then disappearing for a number of reasons. I want to focus on the feminist platform that was the Lebanese feminist platform that was created after the Beirut blast for a number of reasons. One, without going too much into the tensions in Lebanon, it was the first time we were able to have together feminist, let me call them WFOs, women and feminist organizations who were Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian on the one hand. On the other hand, we also had groups working with migrant women, domestic workers. On the other hand, also groups working with refugees, queer groups, queer folks, LGBTI groups, and also academic organizations. That composition is, the least one could say, is a little bit unusual because there are many diversions and many tensions. And I remember the first statement that we had to write, one of the first divisive issues we had to deal with is that we had two positions on sex workers versus women in prostitutions. And that was one of the issues that was, could have been potentially divisive amongst the groups. The different groups there. The second issue, which was also, threatening, was when the attack on Gaza happened last May, and we wanted to issue a feminist statement on the attack. I can tell you that there was no consensus, and it was a whole process of negotiation to get to a consensus of a simple statement saying why are we concerned about this attack? Why is this issue feminist? So there was this diversity in terms of where do people come from, who they are as feminist activists, and also what are their political and ideological background, which is really unusual. The other difference was that we had a mixture of organizations that we can call development organizations that work in development and that are community, that do community development, community empowerment, whatever, all the classics that we know from the 80s. We had groups who only work on political participation, on women's political participation. And then you had different groups which had a much more sophisticated and inclusive narrative, which were way more inclusive in terms of sexual orientation and gender identities. So, and these groups do not engage together except within the framework of that feminist platform. And, also, if given the privilege of being able to compare, until now, touch wood, there has been a consistency of the group members in terms of continuing to work together and continuing to basically identify together opportunities for collective actions. The most recent one is a collaboration in terms of, with the countdown towards the next parliamentary elections. The fourth point is given, and I think Huda mentioned it, the issue of international funding and so on, and we know how divisive this is, and we know that we're all kind of in a competition vis-a-vis the same sources of funding. There has been, and might I say organically, a way to kind of talk together to donors on certain issues, be it political participation, be it, the agenda of donors after the blast, how to do an analysis of the impact of the blast. So I would say, it may not, if you analyze what is happening now, you may not find it outstanding, but if you compare to experiences, some of them are not so, are not so far back. We will see a great, we will see a difference in terms of how these groups, how these women and feminist groups, and I would say others, development groups, are actually have found a common denominator one way or the other. Now, how do we analyze this, and what do we make of it, and how important it is to actually keep monitoring this experience? One thing that stands out also, which is not a secret, and maybe the factor that explains everything, is the role of UN Women. It was actually the spark to start this whole thing was UN Women, and UN Women. I've never personally had an experience of something happen in this way, where UN Women has actually invested in nurturing, creating, and also mitigating differences in opinions, let me say, amongst group members. Would this change if UN Women pulls out? Because at one point, this platform will have to be totally local, totally owned by feminists. I'm sure something will happen. I don't know what, but this role that UN Women has played and is still playing is actually decisive in terms of the longevity, in terms of the quote unquote harmony that exists amongst the group members. The second thing, which for me is even more important, is actually how, contrary to all the previous time, we have been able to find common denominators. Not only this has not happened before, this has killed previous experiences in collaboration before. And this has been the role played by the emerging feminists of the group, not my generation or the one before. The emerging feminists, the younger feminists in the groups, and I would call them maybe the fresh feminists, the fresh intersectional feminists in the group, have played a critical role in overcoming differences, and even in resolving issues, even in resolving issues that were incredibly divisive, such as sex workers versus women in prostitution, such as, for instance, bringing the issue of having a joint position vis-a-vis Palestine at a time when the group members do not have a joint position on this issue, and at a time when also UN Women retracted totally when it was a case of putting out there a statement on Palestine. Suddenly it was like, not our role. This is a civil society. This is a civil society platform. We cannot take any position. This is your own statement. So it's really bizarre. The way the role has been shaping, the role of UN Women has been shaping in a selective way, depending on the situation. And the third thing is, and this circles back to the role of UN Women, maybe as kind of, playing a make or break role in the longevity and in the continuity of this platform is the brokering of the relation between the feminist platform and serious donors. UN Women has been playing this role to the extent that it does seem to many of the members of the platform that this is where you want to be if you want to basically be part, or at least be part of influencing the decision of international donors and be at the forefront as a mover and shaker in terms of what is it that you can influence as a feminist agenda vis-a-vis the donor. So which leaves us actually with a number of points and questions for the moment, for now, the moment in time now, and also for the future. When I was writing this paper for the volume, Setani, I kept asking myself, can we predict? Do we know what's going to happen? Also, if UN Women's role, maybe not pulling out, but if it dwindles, if it doesn't play that brokering role, if it decides not to play that convening role, what can happen? What will happen? Would we as women and feminist organizations continue to see the merit of being together? Number one. Number two, something really interesting happened in the feminist platform, which had never happened before. And this is again the virtue of hanging around for a few decades, which is the leadership. Queer folks and queer activists came to the leadership of the feminist platform, and actually as leaders and also as examples, leading by example in terms of what they are doing on the ground. And I will remind all of us of the amazing initiative that took place with another sub network of queer folks and queer organizations, which is called Yalla Care, and which I think is an amazing example of how all these organizations got together to address the implications of the Beirut blast on queer communities in Mar Mikhail and its surrounding, which were completely destroyed by the blast. So that kind of leadership role, that role in the role in terms of being vocal and being out there and being influencing of that network. Has this been really appropriated by all the groups? And I can tell you that if we look at the 40+ members, some of the groups, if not many, are incredibly conservatives and still work very much within the binary, and that is not their usual modus operandi. These kind of alliances are not natural alliances for them, so to speak. A second and very, very useful, not useful, but I think very critical thing to follow up and to see what happens. And the third thing is definitely the role of funding. To which extent will the fact that there is an ongoing relationship with donors, these relationships are being made possible through being in a platform, as opposed to being on one's own, each women and feminist organization being on its own. Will this be also a make or break factor? We're really not sure. So yet another another question which I really think we need to invest in thinking about. Certainly for me, it has become a most important thing to follow up and to understand what might happen, how will this evolve, in the future. And the last thing I want to say is, we can very easily now see the difference that exists between this platform, the context that made it happen, and the different factors that are sustaining it until now. We can also, with the benefit of hindsight, understand and analyze what caused the demise of previous feminist or at least women-led organizations network. But this, to me, the more I think about it, and the more I, look at interviews which were done in the past, etc., keep making me think that there are serious knowledge gaps in what we know about previous initiatives, and we haven't, as usual, we have not invested the time, the effort, the resources that are needed to understand really what happens in the different experiences that we've had in Lebanon in women and feminist organizations trying to work together. And I think it's way beyond saying, what is obvious now, what is different between that particular experience and what is happening before. And I think I want to end by saying this is an opportunity for serious investigation of what is unfolding in front of us in terms of feminist platforms involved in different forms of mobilization. And I think our mistake and my generation's mistake, even before the Beijing conference, is that of not investing or not understanding how critical it is to be documenting history as it's happening, which is something that at least at the Asfari Institute we're trying to do now, which is actually working with people to document history as it is unfolding now. And I think with this, I want to just stop, and then maybe some questions will arise in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. شكرا لينا، شكرا هدى ديما. زميلي الياس رح يقرأ إذا في أي أسئلة تجينا عبر فيسبوك، بس حابة إنه نبدأ النقاش من يعني المكان اللي انتهت منه لينا، ولكن هدى أثارت هذا الموضوع وديما بطريقة أخرى، اللي هي مسألة المؤسسة الانستتيوشناليزيشن. وطبعا يعني بتقدر تفهموا ليش إحنا كالمجلس العربي هذا موضوع بهمنا. فمن ناحية يعني السبكترم أو هالمساحة بين أهمية المؤسسة ونوع الاستمرارية اللي بتمكنها المؤسسة، الاستدامة إذا بدنا نستعمل هاي العبارة، ومن ناحية فقدان حيوية ما كان الموضوع، سواء كانت حول النسوية يعني فقدان الحيوية، فقدان بجوز النوع أو جزء من القوة الباور للأفكار وللأعمال فبنيجي لفكرة ديما أهمية الاكسبيرمنتيشن، أهمية المساحات التجريبية ومساحات جديدة لمحاولات جديدة اللي بتغير المؤسسات، أو نأمل أنها يعني بترجع للمؤسسات وبتغيرها نوعا ما. يعني كلكم بتعرفوا طبعا فكرة إنه التغيير من يكون فعال أكثر من الهامش، إنه دور الهامش في التغيير، في تغيير المجتمع، في تغيير المؤسسات. فبحب أسمع منكم، يعني كلكم تطرقتوا لهذا الموضوع بطريقة أو أخرى، فممكن تعطونا شوية أفكار للمستقبل كمان، يعني ضمن هالظروف اللي إحنا عايشينها، ظروف التغيير السريع اللي عم نعيشها. هل يعني نوعا ما هل الطيارة أوكي، هل الجهود لازم تتركز على المؤسسة ولا بالعكس على فتح مساحات ويعني let a thousand flowers bloom وخلينا نزيد التجارب ونزيد المحاولات وإلى آخره، ولا في حل وسط بين الاثنين؟ بحب أسمع منكم أي أفكار حول هذا. نبدأ مع هدى وبعدين ديما وبعدين نرجع لديما.
شكرا ساتني على إثارة هذا الموضوع المهم فعلا. وأنا دايما في رأيي يعني أعتقد إن ليست المسألة الوسط ولكن السياق. أنا أشعر إن السياق هو أهم شيء في الموضوع. يعني لو اعتبرنا إن في سياق مستقر وبالتالي المأسسة هنا بتكون مهمة جدا جدا، لأن مما لا شك فيه المأسسة تستطيع أن يعني يكون في تراكم نبني عليه أجيال تستلم من أجيال. فالمأسسة مهمة جدا لأنها أيضا خاصة. بس طبعا السؤال هنا أي نوع من المؤسسة أو أي نوع من المأسسة. لو كانت المأسسة لو تتحول المأسسة إلى قيود، إلى عرائض من ما هو ممكن وما هو ليس ممكن، هنا بقى دخلنا في أنواع من المأسسة يعني المدمرة. فهو هنا المأسسة بشكل عام تدعم وتحقق تراكم، لكن أي نوع من المؤسسات التي نريدها طبعا ده سؤال مهم في العالم العربي. يعني ويرجع تاني لفكرة الجامعات العربية ومدى قدرتها على توفير الحماية اللازمة وضمان حرية التعبير والتفكير وإنتاج المعرفة للأكاديميين فيها. النقطة الثانية إن فترات الحراك يعني فترات السيولة زي ما بنقول أحيانا فعلا المبادرات الفردية بتكون أهم، وإحنا شفنا ده في ال10 سنين اللي فاتوا. يعني في ال10 سنين اللي فاتوا فعلا في عزوف عن تشكيل مؤسسات، في فكرة المبادرات، الانفورمال جروبس، كل الحاجات دي، وده مفهوم واعتقد انه مهم وعامل زخم مهم في فترة المؤسسات ربما لا تستطيع ان تعمل بالشكل الكافي يعني او الجيد. فانا يعني ردي البسيط على الفكرة هي السياق هو الحاكم، لانه ونسال انفسنا دايما عن الجدوى. يعني لو المؤسسات الموجوده في فتره زمنيه معينه هي مؤسسات يعني متهالكه مقيده لا تؤدي عملها بالشكل الحقيقي، يبقى قلتها احسن. لكن لو في فترة استقرار استطعنا أن نبني مؤسسات تستطيع أن تستمر ويكون لها الحرية وكذا، يبقى ما لا شك فيه طبعا دي ممكن تلعب دور مهم.
أي أفكار حول هذا الموضوع؟
كتير حبيت اللي قلته دكتورة هدى بخصوص السياق. حسب السياق أو المبادرات الفردية عندها تكون قوة أكتر وحرية أكتر من المؤسسات المؤسسة. ما عندي جواب يا هي بعتقد يا شيء تجريبي يا شيء مؤسس. كمان بفهم حسب السياق، بس بعتقد اللي عم فكر فيه هو كتير مهم. كل أنواع الأورجنايزنج أو كل أنواع الستراكتشرز يكونوا بعتقد موجودين. بس بفكر يعني اللي بيجي على بالي هو حتى بالمؤسسات المؤسسة والأكبر الصغيرة والكبيرة قد ايه يمكن مهم التجربة والنمو والتغيير يكونوا ممارسة، وإذا فينا نقول عنها قيمة بتكون شيء شوي أكتر normalized، يمكن بخفف من هيدا الريستريكشنز وهي السيريسنس تبع البلاتفورمز الأكتر أو الانستتيوشنز أكتر مؤسسة. وحتى لو كتير من التوبكس اللي بنحكي عنها هي سيريس أكيد، بس بعتقد هيدا فكرة التجربة ويمكن حتى اللعب، التغيير والاعتراف بالتغيير والاعتراف بتغيير المسار إذا اضطرينا أو رأينا في حاجة إله، يكون هيدا جزء دايما من عملنا.
اوكي.
لينا
Yes.
يعني مسألة التمويل اللي ذكرتيه طبعا كتير مهم، يعني المؤسسة دائما مرتبط بالتمويل خارجي أو غير خارجي أو
Exactly. Definitely هيدي certainly، بس بالإضافة لذلك يعني باللي عم بشوفه يعني بطريقة كيف how is it unfolding، كيف عم يعني عم تتطور الديناميكية بالبلاتفورم. بحس انه يمكن في تخوف من هالموضوع، مشان هيك ابتدينا بالاول بقصه خلي يكون عندنا تشارتر، خلي يكون عندنا شو هي الاشياء اللي بتجمعنا، وهذه ما كانت سهله، يعني انك تطلعي تشارتر بعد شو اللي بدنا اياه كمجموعه نسوية، ولكن ما بنتفق على كتير اشياء، يعني كانت ديجا يعني خطوة كتير وصلت، بس كانت متعبة، ما كانت بهالبساطة يعني. وانا بفتكر انه موضوع المؤسسة ما بتخيلها رح تنطرح هلا، ولكن بس تنطرح حيكون فيها يعني جانب له علاقة بالتمويل مثل ما قلتي، جانب له علاقة بالليدرشيب، يعني مؤسسة يعني بدك تعملي هرمية معينة، مش رح تكون فلات يعني. فهيدي القيادة والريبريزنتيشن حتكون قضية. ثالث شيء واهم شيء يعني في الجانب البوليتيكال اللي هي العلاقه بالسلطات. في عدد كبير من مش كبير، خلينا لا ما I don't want to exaggerate، في عدد من النساء بهالبلاتفورم مرشحات على الانتخابات. ما بنعرف يعني من هون لشهر ايار ما بنعرف شو بصير، ولكن كمان انك تكوني ببلاتفورم وفيمينست بلاتفورم يمكن احدى عضواتها تكون تربح بالانتخابات ام شيء، هيدا الديناميك كمان يعني مش ممكن الا ما نتصور انه هيدا حيكون له تاثير على الديناميك. طيب انت كبلاتفورم مفروض او متفق عليه انه كمان جزء من شغله هو ادفوكسي. الادفوكسي وقت بيكون في بين المجموعه ناس داخله بالمنظومه السياسيه، هذه غيرت إذا بدك شوي يعني موازين القوى. هذا كله بس أقول إنه بشعور الحول بهالموضوع بالذات، بس الموضوع اللي حكيت فيه إنه يعني بعد شوي بكير لنفكر فيه، وإذا تفكر فيه بس بدي تفكر فيه already بنعرف إنه في هالأشياء رح تبرز ورح تعمل شوية يعني رح يكون لها تأثير let's say على البروسيس تبع المؤسسة.
Thank you. بدي أسأل كمان سؤال أثارته أو مداخلة ديما خلتني أفكر فيه. يعني لينا عم تحكي طبعا عن تجربة بلبنان، ديما حكت عن 3 تجارب مختلفة ببلدان مختلفة، هدى حكت عن السياق المصري وبشكل عام. يعني خلينا نناقش شوي بعض الاختلافات المفارقات بهاي المنطقة اللي عم نسميها العالم العربي، واللي هي طبعا غير متجانسة في ظروف مختلفة، بس في أشياء كتير مشتركة كمان. فدايما يعني بواجهنا مسألة التعميم وشو اللي بنقدر نقوله عن المنطقة، وهل لازم نحاول نحكي عن المنطقة كمنطقة في هذا المجال. يعني عم بسأل بمجال الأبحاث النسوية، الفكر النسوي، الحراك النسوي. يعني بعرف إنه كلكم عندكم تجارب ببلدان مختلفة من المنطقة، وعندكم معرفة بالأجندات وبالممارسات. يعني عندنا السبتايتل أو العنوان الفرعي للجلسة هي الأجندات والممارسات. فممكن يكون في تشابه بالأجندات واختلاف بالممارسات، ممكن يكون في تشابه بالممارسات اختلاف بالأجندات. يعني هل من أي أفكار تعليق حول هذا الموضوع؟ برضو نبدأ هدى ديما لينا إذا ممكن، وبعدين في سؤال بالفرنسي الياس بدك تساعدني.
نعم بعد الإجابات سأطرح السؤال.
أوكي تفضلي هدى.
نرجو تشغيل الصوت دكتورة هدى.
بدور على الميوت، معلش. تمام لقيته. صحيح، هو التعميم دايما في مشكلة، ولكن يعني هو شيء إنساني، محتاجين نعمم عشان نعرف نتكلم. وفي العالم العربي في أشياء كتير مشتركة صراحة طبعا، وفي اختلافات، لكن بشكل عام مثلا لو احنا اتكلمنا، لو أنا يعني هرجع لموضوعي وهو فكرة إنشاء برامج في مجال المرأة والجندر في الجامعات العربية، بنلاقي تشابهات كتيرة جدا جدا. يعني لو فقط نظرنا للتواريخ هنلاقيها متقاربة. يعني مثلا أنا هنا هو مثلا كانت أواخر التسعينات زي ما ذكرت، بنلاقي Women's Studies Institute في بيرزيت 94، وMA في Gender and Development في 2000. أحفاد يونيفرسيتي برضو كان عندهم ماجستير جندر اند ديفلوبمنت في سنة 97. الأردن 98 سنتر فور ويمن ستاديز وعملوا ماجستير في 2006. بالمغرب بنبص على جامعة فاز 98. يعني باختصار يعني والموضوع مستمر. يعني فعلا هنلاقي فكرة بدايات ما يسمى بالجيل الجديد من منظمات المجتمع المدني، فعلا في تقارب كبير جدا بين البلدان العربية في ظهورها. يعني فدي ظاهرة. برضو بنفس فكرة علاقة معظم برامج الدراسات في المرأة والجندر في الجامعات العربية بالتحديد مرتبطة بفكرة الMDGs الميلينيوم ديفلوبمنت جولز. طريقة إنشائها نفس مرتبطة جدا بالميلينيوم جولز. كونها لها علاقة أو يعني بتشبه الNGOs اللي اتعملت في الثمانينات. ففي شيء يعني في طبعا لما بنقول بلاد عربية مش كل البلاد العربية، يعني احنا بنتكلم، لكن ممكن نتكلم على لبنان وعلى المغرب وعلى مصر وعلى لبنان، تونس في تشابه كبير، الأردن أيضا، ففي يعني تشابه كبير. لو هنخصص لكل بلد عربي أكيد هيبقى فيه حكاية مختلفة شوية. فيعني بشوف إن أنا شخصيا أرى إننا نقدر نتكلم على العالم العربي، وأكبر دليل على هذا الثورات العربية. يعني برضو إحنا ناس كتير قاعدة تقول لنا ما فيش عالم عربي، لا هو في عالم عربي، في لما اندلعت الثورات سمعت. فيعني واضح إن في علاقة يعني بسبب اللغة، بسبب القرب، في حاجات مشتركة كتير. فموضوع شائك أنا عارفة، وفي أخذ وعطا كتير، بس يعني في قدر من التعميم اللي نقدر نستخدمه طبعا، مع اعتبار إن في اختلافات مهمة ما بين البلدان طبعا. يعني
شكرا. ديما.
ديما الصوت
ديما.
كنت عم بقول أنه إذا عم نفكر بالمساحات أو المجموعات النسوية، من دايما في نستقي الوحي من بعضنا، ومن أكثر الأشياء اللي هيك بنتعلم من بعضنا، نتحمس من بعضنا. الاختلاف هو منه كبير، هو بيكون مساحة للتعلم، بس هو في شيء أرضية كتير مشتركة لحتى عن جد نحكي مع بعض ونفهم مع بعض، ويكون الدعم هيك كتير بيحصل بسهولة وسلاسة بعتقد معظم الأوقات. وبالعكس بعتقد هيك الوجود على مساحة واسعة بيساعد أوقات يعني بالدعم وبخلق شبكات متواصلة. فإيه يعني يمكن الأجندات تختلف حسب الموضوع وحسب السياقات، بس أكيد في تفكير دايما عم بيحصل ومن فترة طويلة، ويعني تاريخيا تفكير سوا برؤية مشتركة، ممارسات عم تاخد الوحي من بعضها، عم تستفيد من بعضها، من دعم بعضها. فأكيد فينا نحكي عن شيء مشترك.
Thank you. لينا، thoughts؟ أي أفكار؟
ست ما بعرف، كان بفكر شوي بالنسبة للسؤال اللي طرحتيه، وكمان مثل ديما يمكن ما عندي جواب جاهز، بس بحس اللي عم نشوفه هلا جموع. خليني بس ركز يمكن على لبنان بهالوضع، انه الاكترز الفاعلات بهالموفمنت كتير صار متعدد which is great. يعني ناشطات السبعينات في كتير منهم، أو حتى الستينات في كتير منهم بعد موجودين معنا، السبعينات كمان، الثمانينات إلى آخره. So فيك تشوفي هلأ إذا عملتي بس توبوغرافي حالية لليوم، حتشوفي يعني حتشوفي من المجموعات الجديدة يلي خطابها مختلف وطرقها مختلفة. وأنا بشجع الكل عن جد يطلعوا على التقرير يلي عملوه يلا كير لما بعد لشغلهم على الأرض ما بعد الانفجار، لنشوف فعلا طريقة كليا مختلفة بالعمل على الأرض وبمناهضة كل أشكال المصاعب. هيدا موجود بيناتنا. وكمان يلي علقانين بالفيرست ويف يعني عن جد ستاك موجودين كمان هيدا، وفي كل يلي ان بتوين بيروح وبيجي، كله موجود. بحس هلا بلبنان مع كل صغره ومع كل الناس اللي فلت والى اخره. بس there's a diversity وبالنسبه لي في اكثر اختلافات من انه طرائق عمل هي ذاتها، ممارسات هي ذاتها، او اجندات هي ذاتها. بيبقى انه في اذا بدك convergence، ما بعرف convergence اوكي يس في بعض القضايا يلي بصراحة no brainer في convergence عليها، في التقاء بوجهات النظر عليها، يلي هي لها علاقة ب the lowest common denominator، أسوأ شيء يلي الكل بيعتبروه، يلي صار ورانا إذا بدك من قصة إنه نناقش عليه إذا كان إيه أو لا وبأي طريقة وإلى آخره. من جهة هو موضوع يعني قوانين الأحوال الشخصية الدينية، يعني في قليل من الاختلاف صار عليها. شتى أنواع العنف كمان، يعني طلعنا من قصة إنه الناس مختلفة عليها. يعني هيدي إذا بدك شو اللي لازم يتغير أو شو اللي بطل يصير موجود. بس في أشياء تانية مختلفين احنا عليها يلي هي أبسط. يعني مشاركة النساء بالسياسة منه موضوع جامع بصراحة، لأنه بنفتكره إنه بسيط، وبنفتكره كمان إنه lower common denominator، بس بفوت بشيء أكبر يلي هو بتشاركي ضمن المنظومة أو actually بدك تغير المنظومة وتشاركي فيها. So جوابي يمكن طويل كتير، بس what I want to say إنه في من كله. يعني في نقط معينة متفقين على أهميتها مثل هيدي مثل اللي وصفتها. في نقط قد لا تكون تبين إنه مهمة ولكن في خلاف كبير عليها. بس أنا what I feel إنه الشيء الأهم يلي تغير بهال10 سنوات الأخيرة شيء، يعني شيء الكونسرفاتيف او ابو بين يعني العالقات والعالقين بالموجه الاولى والثانيه، خطاب والمساحه حول اذا بدك ما هو نون باينري تغير كثير. يعني برايي اتليست وبدسكشنز مع الزميلات والى آخره، برأيي إنه تغير. والصوت القوي اللي كان بثورة 17 تشرين I think ما في I would like to think إنه ما في عودة عنه، ما في عودة لورا من ناحية الثريشولد يلي خلقه.
تمام.
Thank you.
لدينا سؤالان باللغة الفرنسية. صحيح، سأطرحهما معا وأترك لكن الإجابة عن أحدهما أو كليهما. سأطرحهما باللغة العربية، يعني سأحاول تعريبهما مباشرة كي تكون الإجابات أيضا باللغة العربية. السؤال الأول يقول: هل يمكن تحديد الحركات المختلفة التي تنتظم وتتهيكل فيما بينها؟ تحدثتن عن النسويات والحركة الكويرية، هل تعملان معا أم ثمة فجوة وتباعد بين الحركتين كما هي الحال في المغرب؟ هذا السؤال الأول. السؤال الثاني: برأيكن وبناء على تجاربكن، هل استطاعت المقاربات الجندرية النهوض ودفع ودعم حقوق المرأة في الدول العربية، أم أنها أدت بالعكس إلى تراجع هذه المطالب وتقويضها؟
أنا فيني شوي ستني إذا بدك أحكي عن تاني السؤال. إذا بدك. بصراحة يعني ما بفتكر هي بهيدي، ما في شيء اسمه استخدام مقاربة نوع اجتماعي، يعني مقاربة جندر. الجندر هو أداة تحليلية، أداة يلي بتخلينا نحلل موازين القوى والعلاقات بين أفراد متنوعين بالمجتمع تبعنا. وليست هي إذا بدك يعني في هاي أو في شيء تاني، بالعكس هي بس نقدر نفهم كيف تتعاطى الناس مع بعضها، على أي أساس، كيف يتم توزيع القوى، كيف يتم شو هي مستويات الأوبريشن، الياس، اضطهاد، هرمية الاضطهاد، البوزيشناليتي، موقع، كيف، شو اللي بيحدد موقع الأشخاص، شو اللي بيحدد قوتهم، شو اللي بيحدد أشكال وممارسات العنف المختلفة. فبالتالي هيدا منه شيء هو دفش أو رجع لورا أو إلى آخره، هي أداة إطار تفكيري وإطار تحليلي يلي بس بخلينا نتقدم بتحليلنا ونشوف إنه هنالك تعددية كتير كبيرة بالهويات وبالأشخاص وين موجودين وإلى آخره، وبدون ما نفهم كل هالعلاقات يعني وكل هالتقاطعات، خلينا نقول كل ترجمتها لوحدها بدون مساعدتك ليس، بدون ما نفهم كل هالتقاطعات يلي أطر مفاهيم النوع الاجتماعي ساعدتنا فيها، ما فينا نفهم مجتمعاتنا كيف مركبة وليش ناس طاغية على ناس تانية. يلي بحس إنه يعني والله هيدي رجعتنا لورا أو إلى آخره، أنا ما عندي نفس يعني ما عندي نفس التصور بهالموضوع يعني.
Thank you. أي حدا ثاني؟
أكرر السؤال الأول دكتورة ديما، هل أكرر السؤال الأول؟ الفرق يعني الفرق بين النسوية والحركة الكويرية، وهل تعملان معا أم ثمة فجوة بينهما كما هي الحال في المغرب؟ هذا دائما يطرح هذا السؤال، يعني التمييز بين الحركات النسوية والكويرية. تفضل دكتورة.
يعني أعتقد أنا ممكن بس مداخلة صغيرة، أنا أسيب السؤال الأول لديما، أعتقد هي ممكن ترد عليه، بس تعليق سريع على برضو فكرة استخدام مقاربة الجندر. هو معنى يعني إحنا دايما نقول الجندر خرج من عباءة الدراسات النسوية، ومعناه بشكل بسيط جدا، وهو فكرة أن التمييز ضد النساء هو بسبب يعني أنه في تشكيل اجتماعي وثقافي للجنسين، وأنه هذا التشكيل الاجتماعي والثقافي هو في الواقع جزء أساسي في علاقات القوى غير المتوازنة في المجتمع. ففي فكرة التركيز على ان احنا لا نتحدث عن انه النساء عايزين يبقوا رجال، ولا انه التمييز، المسألة ليست بيولوجية ولكنها لها علاقة بالثقافة والمجتمع، ثم التركيز على فكرة علاقات القوى ما بين الجنسين. هي ده أساس أعتقد منظور الجندر واستخدامه بطرق مختلفة جدا. لكن هو طبعا السؤال مهم، لأنه يبقى المصطلح ويبقى المفهوم يعني مش كل الناس محتاج متخصصين علشان يفهموه. ففعلا بنجد في يعني في المساحات العامة، أو ربما لو الواحد بيتكلم ويعمل محاضرة مع غير متخصصين، بنحتاج دايما ربما إننا نوضح المفهوم، نشرحه، نترجمه ترجمة شارحة علشان يوصل للمستمعين، لأنه مازال غير مفهوم وغير متداول، وله طبعا دلالات غلط كتير جدا جدا. فهو سؤال مهم، لأنه فعلا هنا بقى بندخل في نقطة في الواقع قالتها دي ريم في الجلسة الأولى عن أهمية وجود جلوسري للمصطلحات نبقى متفقين عليها، لأن احنا اوريدي مثلا في موضوع الجندر ده في ناس هتقول جندر، في ناس هتقول نوع اجتماعي، في ناس هتقول يعني أصلا احنا مش متفقين على المصطلح العربي اللي بنستخدمه كلنا، فكل واحد بيستخدم مصطلح. فهو الموضوع يعني مرتبط أساساً بفكرة وجود مفهوم واضح للناس، وطبعاً مشكلة بقى الترجمة بشكل عام، ودي مشكلة أخرى يعني. بس.
في انطلق مثلا من فكرة المصطلحات، ومن يمكن السؤال الثاني لأحكي عن السؤال الأول. في نوع من هيك مقاربة أو تفريق، كونتراست بيصير بين المجموعات اللي بتشتغل على النسوية والمجموعات اللي بتشتغل على حقوق المرأة. مجموعات حقوق المرأة التقليدية أكثر، والمجموعات النسوية اللي مش دايما بس كثير من الأوقات بتكون أكثر فاهمة مثلا الأمور، حتى لو مش من مقاربة كويرية، بس الجنسانية والجندر بمقاربة شوي أكثر نقدية. فمن هون كمان يعني مشان هيك ما كتير فهمتك تباعد بين نسوية وكويرية، بس أكثر تباعد بين خطاب حقوق مرأة وخطاب كويري. بس كمان في يفكر كيف مثلا المجموعات النسوية والكويرية خاصة الشابة يمكن مش دايما بيكون هدفها الإصلاحات القانونية، هي واحدة من الفروقات البيناتها، إنما التغيير الاجتماعي أبدا مش مقاربة حقوقية. فإذا بدي أجاوب على نسوية وكويرية definitely يعني ما في عامة المجموعات والأفراد والمشهد النسوي والكويري كتير واسع وشاسع، وصل لمرحلة يعني صار واسع. في كتير محلات فيه تباعد يمكن، بس ككلمة نسوية بعتقد هي شوي أقرب وفيها أكتر شوي تفهم، مش دايما بس بتفهم الكويرية أكتر من غيرها. بس أكيد بدل في تناقضات، بدل في tensions, disagreements, عدم
عدم توافق وعدم اتفاق،
عدم توافق على من المفاهيم إلى طريقة التنظيم حول موضوع ما.
شكرا للجميع، يعني شكر خاص لكل المتحدثات في الحلقتين، ريم جودي، مزنة المصري، مي أبو مغلي، هدى الصدى، دينا قادي، لينا أبو حبيب. شكرا لكم. شكرا لشريكنا في تنظيم هالجلستين، اليونسكو، مكتب اليونسكو في القاهرة. وشكرا لكل المشاركين. طبعا مواضيع ما إلها نهاية ورح نستمر فيها إن شاء الله في حلقات مقبلة. إلياس، أي كلمات أخيرة؟
نهاية هذه الحلقة إذن الثانية، ومعها نختتم حلقتين اليوم حول العلوم الإنسانية النقدية في المنطقة العربية، أجندات وممارسات. أضم صوتي إلى صوت ستاني لأشكر جميع المتحدثات والمنظمة الشريكة اليونسكو وجميع من انضم إلينا في كلتا الحلقتين، وطبعا الشكر للمترجمتين اللتين رافقتانا بترجمة فورية في الحلقتين. يمكنكم مشاهدة هذه الحلقة مجددا والحلقة الأولى اليوم التي سبقتها على قناتنا في يوتيوب، فضلا عن باقة من حلقات النقاش والندوات والمحاضرات والفيديوهات. إلى حينها واكبوا منصاتنا الاجتماعية فيسبوك وتويتر وموقعنا الإلكتروني dcs.org لمزيد من التفاصيل والمعلومات حول الحلقات النقاشية والأنشطة الافتراضية المقبلة. إلى لقاء قريب. شكرا.
شكرا.